Michael, Paul DeLuca, fantastic to meet you. Thank you so much for joining us today on The Growth Game. We are all about growth, and especially in staffing, and we really appreciate you as a CEO, meeting with me as a CEO, get to know each other a little bit, and having some really good interchange back and forth. So thank you for your time.
Sounds great. Appreciate your time.
So Michael, I'm just going to give you my background really quick. I started out as a very young entrepreneur in staffing. I was not a banker. I was not a lender. I was a staffing guy. And so came from a long line of staffing, built a really nice business in the 90s and used accounts receivable funding to grow my business. It worked out great. I knew finance. I enjoyed it. I decided after a while I was so into helping entrepreneurs and whether that be my competitors or just being able to give, that I found that it made a lot of sense for me to exit the staffing business and go into the finance business, which I've done. And now since 1999, that's been my primary occupation. I've financed over 800 staffing companies, and I absolutely love my business. Every single day, I love getting up and working with staffing companies and helping them grow.
That's fantastic.
So very growth oriented. That's what it's all about. And so that's me. So Michael, I'd love to hear quickly your background and I know that you were really in other sales, you were in pharmaceuticals, you were doing some other things and then got into staffing. Love to hear your journey. Tell us how you got here.
Yeah, well, like many, I fell into staffing on accident. I actually went into staffing directly after college back in the late 90s and was there 4 or 5 years and then said, hey, there's got to be more than this. So that's when I went into pharmaceuticals for almost 5 years and then realized there's not more to this and staffing's actually a pretty good gig. I'm a big fan of
I agree. I've heard that before.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a grind, right? I mean, you need to master the art of persistence and grit, certainly, as anytime you're dealing with people as a product, people let you down. And that's something that you have to understand with the business. And I think as an early career person, I didn't have necessarily that perspective at that point. So went into pharmaceuticals, realized that, the staffing thing wasn't a bad gig after all. And I'm a huge fan of pay for performance type of compensation, which staffing certainly was. And not that pharmaceuticals, you controlled so little in the sales side of things.
Right.
And it wasn't really sales. I determined that it was where I wanted to be. And really the primary reason outside of the pay for performance, because money was important to me because I grew up very, very, very poor. That was one piece of it. But another large piece of it was in the staffing game, I was allowed to work and train and develop those around me. And so I got my first taste of kind of a team lead trainer type of role before I went to pharmaceuticals. And I missed that because I was a solo producer in the pharma game and it was quite lonely. It wasn't fulfilling me, right? So that really dovetailed into getting my first leadership opportunity. I have been since 2008, been in the staffing industry, working for a couple of larger global staffing organizations. Was executive leadership there and then had the opportunity to join with my business partner and I now QWorks Group, where we are about 5 years ago. That's when I realized that being an entrepreneur was very different from being an employee.
Such a journey.
It is. And, going from running multi-million-dollar business in a corporate environment with a team of resources around me, right? I had sales enablement, I had accounting, I had marketing, HR, all those things, to becoming the CEO and owner of an organization. And now you're all of those. I'm like, if I can run a $100 million business, I could very easily run and get to $1 million business. Then life really started. So that's a brief overview.
Fun journey. That's great.
In hindsight, it is.
Yeah, of course. You know what I love about what you said, and I love the fact that there is such a group of people in the staffing industry that are driven by running away from their past, running away from where they were. And I love that. It's one of the reasons I love my business so much. Just a little personal thing about me. Growing up, we went broke 3 times. My dad was an entrepreneur. He wanted so badly to be able to provide a good lifestyle, some wealth, but of course, all around still just having a good lifestyle. So he was a hardworking entrepreneur, but we went through those tough times of being really, really poor and then also doing okay. And I think that shaped a lot of who I was.
Absolutely.
Because it made me realize, boy, you've got to have that persistence and that drive. And It's one of the reasons I love talking to entrepreneurs every day and helping them, because I love seeing them come from something where they're trying to do something better for their family. So very, very cool. So how long have you been a CEO now at this point? And
It'll be
sorry,
five.
You mentioned 2008 you were in leadership, but it's 5 years. Okay,
Yeah,
great.
a little over, I guess,
Great.
5.5 years now.
Fantastic.
Since joined
Fantastic.
KeyWorks.
That's beautiful. Well, excellent. Great. So I'd love to understand, you have a very unique perception of seeing some more traditional B2B roles and sales. And how would you really explain kind of the crossover between those? Or what are the similarities? What are the differences that you see in the more traditional B2B sales roles and what you see in an effective sales leader and effective salespeople in staffing and recruiting?
Yeah, no, great question. The one I've actually not thought about, but something I said earlier kind of resonates when you ask that question. Leaving staffing for 5 years and going and selling products is very different. When you're selling a product to an organization, you really truly have your features and your benefits and all these things that, sales 101, if you will, that you should be talking about.
Yep.
In staffing and in business to business, our product is our service offering. Our product are the people that we're providing. Yep. While there are features and benefits to that, organizations are really, and I tell my teams this all the time, organizations are buying the name on the business card. And it's not the company name on the business card.
So well said.
It is Michael Clegg on the business card.
People.
That's right.
Yeah.
So much so that we even added a fifth core value to our organization this past 12 months of connection. And it's because connection is so critical. It is all about relationships. And everyone says that, but it's all about relationships. And while that is true, I don't know that people really understand what that means and how to connect with other people.
Yeah.
And your producers set it off and said it probably as more eloquently than I could. It was like, hey, we're just here to meet, introduce, and be able to give back, add value. That's relationship, right?
That's
and
right.
Finding a value offering that connects with someone is everything. And that's the cool thing about what I do as a CEO of an organization and as a leader in the organization and a leader that teaches other companies how to be great leaders, because I get to give back the knowledge that I've learned through coaches that I've received or coaching that I've received and from coaches that I have in my life. And I believe everybody should have a coach. Everyone should have someone that can unemotionally and objectively provide them feedback. Right. And I get myself in trouble at home.
That's excellent.
Right. And my wife's in the other room. She's probably listening to me right now say this, but sometimes I'm coaching at home.
Yeah, my wife's definitely one of my best coaches. So, I hear you. Yes. I get it.
She's like, hey, and by the way, everyone calls me Clegg, even my wife. She's like, hey, Clegg, I'm not one of your clients. You don't need to coach me.
Okay.
Sometimes you gotta leave that hat at the door. Because it is. It's
not easy.
No, it's not. Because it's a life. It's a life thing for me. Continuous improvement, which is also one of our core values, is a life value of mine, not just my company.
We're very simpatico there. I can absolutely see that already. It's so true to who I am, and I appreciate that. This podcast, The Growth Game, that's what it's all about. It's all about how do we, like you said, give back, connect, but develop these connections. It really is one of the big missing things that's coming out of the newer generations is that because they've been so connected to technology, there's a bit of that they've missed and lost. And I take a lot of time. I don't know if you do as well. I'm sure you do, but I spend a lot of time with younger people as they come up into the business, just working with them on being people who can be approachable.
That's right.
And being people who can literally just stop, put away the technology. I know that's something I do at home, but it's even at business meetings. I ask everybody to put the phone in the middle and upside down.
Right.
Like just let's put the technology away. Let's connect at a deep level, right? And really, it makes business life more enjoyable, right? Is that what I've found?
Yeah,
So,
100%.
Sounds like we're simpatico there. And I find that in leaders. I find that in leaders that show up every day wanting to give back and wanting to grow. And that's part of the reason why it's exciting to do what I do. I love this business for that reason, I think.
That's fantastic.
Very, very interesting. As a CEO, I'm really curious, like if you picked your top 2 leadership philosophies that really makes you who you are and successful as you are, I would love to hear what those are. What's your top 2 leadership philosophies?
And it's great that we didn't prep because you didn't know how important that question is to me. So I developed a framework that's called Leadership Squared. And the reason for that is everything starts with leaders. It doesn't matter. Everything starts with leaders. That is where the standards are set. They don't maintain those standards. The employees do, right? That's where the expectations should be set. So there's two things that make up this framework, and it's culture and connection. There's a whole series of things under each one of those umbrellas of culture and connection. Everything that you point to in an organization will fall under one of those two areas. And it was years of going back and speaking to previous employers and previous colleagues and interviewing employees that, I led at some point and really finding out, hey, what was it? When I get these Leader of the Year awards, why? Why me? Why not somebody else? And when someone else gets it, what are those? What are the reasons? And it inevitably falls under one of those two things. It's the relationship. Nice. How we connect, not just the relationship itself, but how we connect and the things that we do. Yeah. And then the culture, because the culture, remember, is that are those values, beliefs, and expectations. And if you don't have that defined, you're going to get all different types of behaviors, which lead to different outcomes. When you miss that standard piece, you're not going to get to the outcome that you want. When you define that very clearly, so now you're getting rid of all the ambiguity, and people have the expectation, and more importantly, connecting to how they fit into that culture, how they fit into that standard. That's where they get their purpose, which is talk about the younger generation. That's all Gen Z says. It's about purpose. It's purpose. Where do I fit in? How do I know? I want more. I want more. I want more. And while some of that is a level, I think some, because of what you mentioned earlier, lacking connection, there's still some professional immaturity that needs to be developed because they haven't had deeper relationships in their life.
Which is where the leaders comes in. Right. That the leaders can show the connection and can show the culture. It equals now their purpose and they become super involved. I absolutely agree with that. I've seen that, and you articulated that beautifully.
No, I appreciate that. It's funny. So I was having on my day off, I was having a one-on-one with an employee. Last Friday was my birthday, so I took a last minute PTO day. So I did not have my one-on-one with her last week. So I didn't want to go, okay, I'm actually going to be off this Friday for real. So I wanted to keep that. So in the conversation, we were talking about her journey, right? So she's heading into her third full year with the organization in 2024. And we were just talking through the pain and the suffering and the sacrifices that comes with being, a recruiter in this industry. And I asked her, and I said, well, why stay, right? And it wasn't a formal stay interview. And by the way, that's part of our connection piece. You have to have stay interviews, which we can address that later. But we were having an informal, and I said, well, let's catch up about that. What is it? And she said, Clegg, I'm heading into my third full year. I am 3Xing annually what I made before I walked in the door here. And you told me it was going to be hard, and there's been some blood, sweat, and tears, and then that's true. Less blood, more sweat and tears, certainly. She said, I have 3X because you told me to trust the process. And she has. And it made me take a step back to go, I need to find out more stories like this, because everything that we do in teaching is about storytelling, right? We all know that, and that's become very cliche now, but it's true. We're humans. We learn through storytelling. It's true. And I was like, I need more of that because I forget some of those things. It's because I don't really ask that question necessarily, but it was phenomenal that she brought that up because keep in mind, this is a single mom who was working in retail prior to.
You changed her life.
We did. It wasn't a me thing, but certainly I think the standards that we have, inside of Leadership Square, we have ways that we connect and the expectations of those connections and our culture. And we make decisions on that standard. All 5 of our core values are standard driven. We define those values. We give behavior example of those values because I tell my clients all the time, you hire for skill and fire on behavior, right? So let's do both in the beginning.
Let's do both. Absolutely. Right? So, and let's level set what that looks like. What does that outcome actually look like? That's a beautiful example. Very, very nice. Thank you for sharing that. I'm very interested in your, you call it staffing squared. Is that, I'm sorry,
leadership squared.
No, leadership squared. I'd love to see that. Leadership squared. Anything you're willing to share the documentation, I'd love to share with our audience. Just continue to give back. That sounds fantastic. You've spent a lot of time developing something that works. So excellent. Thank you for talking about that. I'm really curious. Let's talk about kind of specifically growth opportunities in today's environment. Really curious what you're saying. We're living in a very interesting economic cycle, one that is different than the last.
Yes.
Interesting economic climate. What are you seeing as the real opportunities for growth during this strange economic cycle for staffing.
Yeah, I see it a couple different ways. And while you're right, I mean, I feel like every economic cycle we're talking about uncertainty, headwinds, all of these things.
Right.
And while they're there, I mean, if you just, saw the news flashes last night and what's going on with our country and getting into things that are going on overseas. I mean, there's a lot that's happening domestically. I mean, you're talking about social grievances. And so there are a ton of headwinds. The thing that most people failed to recognize pre-pandemic was that we were headed for a global labor shortage by 2030. The pandemic just, expedited that. So we do have more jobs than we have people to fill them. So that's a great opportunity in and of itself, right? For those that are the best recruiters, and the best recruiters are those that have the biggest pool of resources. The people that have the biggest pool of resources are the recruiters that have the deepest relationships, right? So once again, everything comes back to culture and connection, even externally in sales. So the opportunity here is to continue to develop. And more importantly, while the world is going crazy about AI and all of the great techniques and new things and about automation. And don't get me wrong, I think they're fantastic. And we're starting to use some of that. But at the end of the day, what I have learned is even when companies replace entire divisions with automation, usually they end up creating more roles behind that. And so I do think there's a unique opportunity because
totally agree with that.
We do know that task-heavy roles are going to be automated. Because for organizations, we see it ourselves, even with what normally could typically have been an administrative duty that someone would have done is being automated. And I'm a small business today, right? At scale, this is a significant opportunity for companies. Well, that cost savings that these companies are generating can now go into new creation of roles. I mean, think about roles that exist now. Just think in the space that we're in. All of the people roles, right? Now we have chief people officers. We have chief diversity officers. We have chief anything that deals with connecting with people, right? So, the opportunity is being on the front end of connecting with those people and with those opportunities. So that is one in and of itself. Uniquely, and it's something that we do in our organization as part of outside of the staffing, we've got an advisory division as well. And that's where I spend a lot of my time is reskilling and upskilling people.
I love that. Absolutely.
So that's going to be a critical one.
Repurpose people to the new positions that are being created constantly. I love that. So it sounds to me like, and I agree with you, that for those that want to only look at the headwinds and bury their hand in the sand and worry about flatlining or their sales dropping, that's what's going to happen. And for those that are being proactive, you're just going to keep pushing and find roles. And I agree with that. I think the bottom line is there's always challenges, but there is a lot of opportunity. And even in this economic cycle, I see companies that are doing, like you said, keeping their eye focused on where is the development, building the culture out, building the connection out. There's just plenty of opportunity.
Yeah, there's one other small segment that I still believe is an untapped segment for labor, and that is the boomer generation. The baby boomers, while we know that technically speaking, they're in 1 to 2 year range of the overwhelming majority of them being out of the workforce. I mean, we are now eclipsing by 2025, I believe, the millennials are going to be 75% of the workforce. So now you're starting to talk about people like myself, who's Gen X, just turned 50 last week, right? So I'm where the boomers were, 20 years ago, which is hard to believe. But that entire segment of workforce who are built differently, their values are entirely different. And all the data, go look at the millions of data that Gallup has collected over the last 20 plus years, and it's phenomenal. You have a resource of individuals in that space, in that demographic that want to still earn. They don't want to work 40 hours a week, but they want to still contribute. And their talent that they have to contribute is excellent. I love that. I agree with that. Well, I'm glad to know that we're almost exactly the same age, because you've got two new 50-year-olds that are still staying at it. Well, happy birthday.
And leading their companies and growing. Yeah, I was just a month ago, so we're almost right. We're almost right there. But I love seeing that. So many times you see the PR, you see the news organizations focusing on early billionaires, early wins, and it's almost like there's this ideal that you've got to be the 30-year-old that wins. And I love it. For the guys that are 30 and 35 that win and make their first $1 billion or whatever their goals are, great. Isn't it true that for many entrepreneurs that succeed in their 40s and into their 50s, we've seen a lot of ups and downs, and we've learned from a lot of our mistakes. And the reality is, you win some, you lose some. But I find that to me, I see more entrepreneurs hitting their stride and having their most success between 45 and 60.
Yeah. Good. That's hopeful for me, because there's 10 years to go till 60. But I think there's something interesting that you said.
Me too.
Right. My thought of being an entrepreneur, I think I had that bug or that gene. And some of that was, if you think about it, my parents were baby boomers. My mom was a stay-at-home mom and the lunch lady. So she was the lady that collected money when you went through in the elementary school, right? Mm-hmm. She cleaned houses, so she was operating in the gig economy before the gig economy was there. But she worked while we were in school, so she was a stay-at-home mom. My dad was in the military, retired there, and then went to work with a defense contractor, and then retired there. So outside the military, he worked for one company. So that's what I was brought up in, is that, hey, you went to work, and when I left my first organization after 5 years, it was like, whoa, are you okay? Is everything? I'm like, no, I'm going for another opportunity. And it's like, what's that? Right. So those of us that weren't exposed to it just didn't know the possibilities. I mean, I was a first generation college student. No one else in my company, in my family, went to college on either side of the family. Right. Yeah. So, it was a lot of changes, a lot of things that my kids now will be exposed to just because of where I am. And so that's the generational leaps that I think are possible. And that's why I do believe it's important to get back to schools. And I do, and I go back to speak at my university, not as much since COVID, but hopefully that picks back up again to expose those younger, soon-to-be professionals of what is possible.
And to show them, or at least put a bug in their ear of what being an entrepreneur is all about. Because I agree, entrepreneurs come from all walks of life, from all different backgrounds, early exposure to no early exposure. It's something that it does have to be kind of in you, and you have to learn to be able to embrace that part of who you are that you may not know yet, right? And then be able to develop it being a successful entrepreneur. And I think that's why I see so many hit their stride in their middle ages, and it's great to see. So, well, excellent. I'm glad you hit your stride and made a decision to be an entrepreneur. I think that's excellent. So, curious, as we wrap up here, I know you've got a hard stop here coming up pretty soon. So just a couple other things. Sure. This has been great. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate your insight. I think the audience is going to really love your insight and really help implement some of these things in their own growth and their own mindset of what they can focus on. But just a couple of things. What do you feel like the staffing and recruiting organizations should be doing right now? Like from an organizational standpoint, what do you find are some of the biggest missing gaps that they should be focusing on?
I don't want to sound cliche on this, but my first instinct was back to relationships,
where they maybe are going more towards automation, more towards offshoring, more towards click and clack through the VMSs. Right. Move away from that is what you're saying. That where's the relationship? Because that's what's the long-term value.
Yeah, because I get it. I mean, I remember getting into the business in the late 90s when they said Monster.com was going to ruin the recruiting industry.
Yeah,
then it was LinkedIn. Yeah. LinkedIn's going to kill recruiting.
Total enablement.
That's exactly right. And every stop of the way, every threat has become an opportunity. I do feel very strongly about the relationship, because I think when you take a look at, even I think back to being an early leader, there are people that I think potentially that left the organization were asked to leave, voluntold, if you will, to leave the organization based on early performance. And when I think back to myself, and this is life in general for me, I've been a late bloomer at everything I've done. And when you lack the relationship or the clarity of the relationship that has very little depth, you miss a lot of things from people. And when you don't connect the company's why or your leader why with their why, you're going to miss a lot. And then it just comes down to KPIs and performance. Well, one thing that I know is when you start measuring culture objectively, those that don't fit stick out very clearly and very plainly. But when you measure KPIs, the people that you could likely keep for the long run may stick out, but they don't stick out in the right way. They stick out in you didn't make enough calls last week. You consistently don't make enough calls. But the calls that you do make, could be developing very deep relationships, very deep long-term relationships that
Right.
ultimately 2 or 3 years down the road produce more. I do
Right.
think, and I found that to be true just because we've experienced some of that internally, our retention is great. I would say going back to the relationship, and this isn't just about a leadership square thing, it is about the leadership square thing, because as I've said in research and spending time, and at some point I'm going to need to take this to someone who can do research for a living to prove this theory, but everything falls into one of those two buckets. It is about leadership squared and it is about connection.
I tend to see that and tend to agree. And I would say just being able to see the way that you've mentioned, you've got to go deeper than KPIs. It's not just the numbers. Because
and those are important. Don't get me wrong.
False positives.
Absolutely. Those are very important.
Absolutely very, very important. You should see my Salesforce.com metrics, man. I mean, my dashboards, are incredible, but they don't tell the whole story. Right. And I agree with you. Every person in an organization, especially in the sales organization, should have a unique selling personality.
Yeah.
And the reality is some of those personalities go for a deeper relationship that is more long-term. So the initial metrics may be lower. The long-term outcome may be higher. I have people in my organization that way that really we've set their KPIs literally a third of what some of the others are. But yet that third equals almost twice the amount of output when you measure over 3 years.
Right.
It's not a one-canned approach. So I appreciate that you feel the same way I do about that. And it takes leaders that are willing to dig in more than just the numbers. Like, what does it really mean and what's the output? So I appreciate it. I think we have time for one more question. So I'd love to ask this one last question. Many of the companies that we finance a lot of middle management, people who have grown up in the staffing organizations, they're working for somebody else, and they finally decide, I want to be an entrepreneur. I want to go out on my own. I want to do this myself, create some lasting wealth for my family. What would you say as advice to the staffing people who will be watching this podcast that haven't yet made a decision, but it's in them? They've got the bug there. They want to do it. What advice would you give them if they're aspiring to be their own leader one day?
Yeah.
What's your top 2 things you would say to them?
So I'm trying to think back to 5.5 years ago, and there's certainly a couple things that stand out. One that stands out the most is certainly the platform. Everyone knows that you should be doing a business plan, but I do believe there needs to be a plan and a structure that is developed before walking in that door. Thinking about, and by this I mean realizing that you can't scale me, right? And that person will not be able to scale themselves. So who are your key partners in HR? Who are your key partners in legal? Who are your key partners in accounting and finance and all those things, so that you can actually focus on the business itself? We didn't have that, initially. We took some lumps. We weren't profitable up through the pandemic. I mean, we were writing checks, to cover payroll.
Yeah.
And while we're not where we want to be today, we are significantly further from where we were just 3 years ago. Recognizing that you can't scale you and understanding that you need partners and you need key partners. And it isn't terribly expensive to do it in the beginning. I mean, it's a cost, don't get me wrong. And these are checks that you're going to write. You will have the ability
to put those people around you.
Absolutely. You will, there's a great book that Dan Sullivan and Dr. Benjamin Hardy wrote called Who Not How. And I wish I'd have read that book 5.5 years ago, because it's all about the who, right?
Yeah.
Don't worry about how you're going to get the platform. Worry about the who's. And when you have the who's in place all throughout, you now can focus on keeping the main thing, which is revenue growth and developing relationships and a great culture internally. All of those things that are key and important. You have that platform because you have the partners to do the things that you don't do well anyways. So that would be,
I love that.
I would summarize that.
So let me see if I can repeat that and make sure I've got you. So your number one advice, you want to start your own staffing business. Number one, know what you do best and put people around you, whether that's outside people, outside partners, it doesn't have to all be internal, but put the people around you that fill in the gaps to give you a cohesive, comprehensive organization. I couldn't agree more. It's something I say to new prospects all the time. We solve their problems for unlimited payroll financing.
Yeah.
That's easy. We got to do a lot of work. But the reality is they've got to have us. If they don't have that component, they're not going to be successful long term. So there's number one. Number two, what I always tell them is, who is going to be your legal? You mentioned that. And then I always focus on also how they're going to mitigate risk on the workers' comp.
Yep.
It's another big gap that a lot of new staffing people don't really manage, unless we're talking about purely a clerical type of position. So I think those are great. Well, those are some excellent advice. I really appreciate meeting you at Clegg. It sounds like that's what you go by, Clegg. Paul here, and we look forward to having a long-term relationship. Love to be able to see where this goes and continue to help influence our organizations, influence the industry. And it was just an absolute pleasure meeting you today. Have a fantastic weekend and hope we can do this again sometime.
Feelings mutual. Enjoy speaking to people like-minded, and there'll be a couple things that I learned from this too. So I appreciate your time.
Sounds great. Excellent. Clegg, thank you so much.
Care.
Have a great
Thank
weekend.
You.